Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, The Top 10 Enterprise Mobile App Development Gotchas and How to Avoid Them. My name is Adam Bookman, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Wanted to thank everyone for the great turnout to our March webinar as part of our monthly webinar series. Want to talk about a few housekeeping items before I turn the floor over to our speaker, Shahab Chowdhury. To begin with, I would like to remind you that feel free to ask questions. We really would appreciate your questions using the Q&A panel on the WebEx screen or on Twitter with the hashtag #MobileStrategy. And remember to follow us at PropelX for some really great information that we put out there. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available at the end of the call, and you'll receive an email with the recording and the opportunity to download the webinar slides, and that will be sent out tomorrow. There'll also be a special offer at the end of the webinar, so please stick around for that. Before I hand it over, I want to give you a brief background on PropelX. PropelX is a company that creates mobile strategies and world-class apps for the enterprise. We're 100% focused on mobile. We work with Fortune 500 clients around the globe. We're based in San Jose and Silicon Valley with offices in Boston and Pittsburgh. The PropelX team, the PropelX founders have been working together for over 15 years, and we have established a great team with some amazing clients, some of whom are on the call today. So welcome. A little bit about what we do. We offer services in 3 areas. We often get started with our clients with one of our mobile strategy workshops. These focus on both the business areas, like, for example, our mobile app roadmap and portfolio, where we help companies define how mobile fits into their overall company strategy and where they should start with mobile. So we look at prioritizing mobile app ideas. We do a lot of mobile app innovation, and then design mobile app rollout plans. We also do work on the IT side, helping IT teams get ready for mobile. That generally starts with an IT maturity assessment on the readiness for mobile, and then a very detailed tactical action plan to ensure that you're ready for the wave of mobile. We also have mobile advisory services where we work in a pool of hours type model to mentor organizations along the way when they have mobile questions. And finally, our mobile app development services. We have some popular offerings. One of them is a rapid app prototype, which is a 1-week amazing workshop where you can take an idea that you have kind of on the back of a napkin and turn it into a working prototype all in 1 week. And then we have the onshore and offshore and nearshore app development services. So enough of the about PropelX, and let's get right into the webinar. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today. His name is Shahab Chowdhury. Shahab is a partner at PropelX. He's a visionary thought leader who's been at the forefront of trying to make sense of various technology shifts in the past 2 decades. For the last 5 years, he's focused exclusively on mobile. He is a trusted advisor to some of the leading brands around the world, and he's a frequent speaker at mobile conferences. You've probably seen him at some of the mobile conferences. Shahab, I will turn it over to you now. Take it away.
Thank you, Adam. Hello, everybody. I am very excited about the topic that we're going to be talking about today. As I talk to companies about their mobile strategies and their mobile application development programs, some of the things that we're going to be talking about today are areas of concern for them, aspects that we're helping companies with, and serves as a great summary of things that you should be thinking about as you go through your app planning and development exercises. a lot of what we'll be talking about, I think, applies to both consumer-facing applications as well as enterprise internal-facing applications. In cases where there are specific considerations, I'll point those out as we go. There are some differences in the approach. A lot of our work is focused on enterprise applications, B2E, B2E2C type of use cases, and that's where we find some interesting challenges that still haven't been solved yet. So we'll point those out as we go. The considerations we'll talk about, we'll have some broad discussions. I'll outline some of the top 10, some of the items that make the top 10 list. And then for specific areas, we'll leave some time at the end for your questions if you have in any of those specific areas. And so with that, let me jump into talking a little bit about some of the trends, some of what we're seeing, just to set the context. And I'm sure a lot of this is data that you may have seen already or are familiar with or are experiencing yourself. But it is no surprise that a lot of your customer interactions are starting to originate from a mobile device. That number is expected to be a very high 70%, which obviously changes the game in terms of how we engage our employees, our partners, our resellers, our consumers that we engage with in conducting business. And what that means in terms of not just mobile device engagement, but the aspect that's really interesting there is that folks are starting to favor apps over the mobile web interaction. So no longer is it okay to have some level of web or mobile web presence, but it is almost a requirement from a brand perception perspective, from a reputation perspective, that if you are a business that has a brand that needs to be perceived as one that's accessible, then mobile apps are a way that people tend to favor as opposed to interactions over the web. So that, I think, has changed the game a little bit for companies that are now looking to understand what does that mean in terms of the responding to that demand. And in a lot of the companies that we're talking to, as well as I am sharing some numbers from a survey that talks about companies are looking to build upwards of 5 applications is kind of the average in 2013. And so 2013, we really think is going to be the year where there's going to be a lot of application development for the mobile platforms. I think it's also the year where the focus is shifting from consumer-facing applications, which a lot of businesses have built and are starting to mature and evolve, but the other types of applications that we're definitely seeing are enterprise employee-facing applications or partner reseller type of applications. And so that's an important trend. I'll point out a few things specific to those types of apps as the discussion progresses here. The other thing that's interesting around this mobile app phenomenon is the demise of the desktop applications. And so I think that's very important from a few different perspectives. One, it means that disciplines and competencies associated with desktop application development in the enterprise, which we grew in the client-server days and evolved them in the online e-commerce days, are going to have to evolve to be able to support the mobile app competencies. And that's a big area of discussion as we talk to various different companies. The other aspect of that is that it is very easy to be able to build mobile apps compared to when you plan an enterprise-level desktop application. These were large, in some cases, monolithic applications that required a lot of resources, millions of dollars to deploy. Mobile apps, on the other hand, are very quick and easy to build. That's good and bad. They are quick to build, but they still require a fair bit of discipline, especially when you talk about enterprise applications. So we'll talk about what kind of dynamics does that introduce into the enterprise application development landscape. With all of this app development that's going on, there are some trends that are new for us in the enterprise. We think that these are things that we have to open our eyes to. The user of the application today is really a lot more unforgiving than what we may have been dealing with in the past. They're quick to download these apps that they're looking for, as discussed in the previous few slides, but they're also very quick to delete those if they don't find them to be useful, or if they find that they don't perform or behave or provide them with the information that they came looking for. So just by way of just sharing some statistics, which is, almost, drives a different discussion around being fearful about what to put out there. But nonetheless, these are metrics that we have to pay attention to. There are a lot of applications that get downloaded. Folks open them once. If they find them to be relevant, or they'll maybe come back to it again. If they don't perceive value in it, they'll be very quick to move away from it. They may not delete it, but they may not ever come back to it. They're also very impatient in terms of how quickly the app loads and launches and gives them something very, very quick. The attention span of mobile app users is, believe it or not, about 9 seconds. And so if you take more than 2 seconds of that time in the download process and the opening process of the app, you've cut the probability that they'll use what you've provided them in half. So important consideration to understand as a backdrop of a lot of your efforts in planning and developing your apps. And if applications crash, I think that's kind of the death of the app. They may come back to it, whether it's enterprise applications or consumer applications, but they may not look at it with the same level of excitement that they may have the first time around. And so the key here is that as I talk through this, they may sound like these are consumer experience expectations, but they really are not, because a lot of your enterprise users are also consumers, and we can chalk that up as a gift of consumerization. A lot of great things came with that, but this change in expectations is a big part of it as well. So I want to share that with you, that this is some of what we're dealing with today, and it is a huge opportunity, no doubt, as we look at this mobile channel. But there's also a very high level of expectations that come with that. And IT and businesses internally in their planning exercises around application development will have to evolve and adapt to be able to overcome that. So as you look at the list of the top 10 things that potentially could get in the way of folks being able to download and use your applications, things that you want to pay attention to, I wanted to share with you by starting off with a list of the top 10 things that we have compiled that we think are a great place to start, and this is the bulk of the conversation for us today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into some of these in more detail, so I have some follow-up slides that go into some of these in a lot more detail, and others we'll touch on, and if we miss one consideration that might be important to you, please ask us questions as we go. So the first one is around just the lack of understanding of what the opportunity really is, and not knowing what is the scenario that you're trying to put into a mobile app, and I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. Then the next couple have to do with just being able to, once you know what the opportunity is, how do you engineer that app to provide the right solution? How do you make sure you plan the right type of deployment? And then how do you make sure that in that application design there's a good level of user experience and polish? So again, from that consumerized expectation, you're able to provide something that is a very polished experience. As you go on down the list, you'll see some that are very tactical, but nonetheless huge gotchas, and they're more last-minute type of items, and others that are more strategic in nature and have to be thought through in a little bit more detail from the get-go. So let me start to jump into some of these. So number one that I talked about, the lack of true understanding of the opportunity. And what that really means is if you try to design an application for which you have never gone through the use case yourself, it's very likely you'll end up designing an application that'll not hit home in terms of the ROI that you're expecting from it. I find a lot of companies are looking at a process flow that was generated somewhere on a whiteboard in somebody's office, and they thought it would be a great idea to turn that into a mobile app. It's leading to what we've been calling the Wild West of app development. If you're building the apps, you have to go and understand and walk in the shoes of the end user. Do role plays, do field observation, do ride-alongs with field service people, do plant visits if you're building something in a manufacturing plant on the line. It really is comical sometimes when we walk in and we do an audit on an application that has been designed for, let's say, a plant floor manager, and there's been no consideration for the types of equipment they may be dealing with, how noisy it might be, what type of lighting there might be, and what type of interaction has been planned has no place on a plant floor. I just will share with you likewise, in a retail environment, running back and forth to the floor, to the stock room, it is a device that if you, for example, are looking to deploy tablets, that sounds like a great idea, but you have to think through that what is the experience of the person who's standing there looking over a tablet. In some retail environments it works great, in other cases it does not. So we would say, from a planning perspective, spend that energy up front, budget for some of the analysts, the designers to actually go in and spend some time with the users, and it does require some investments, but and these people that you design these applications for are oftentimes very busy and cannot allocate the time, but we think it's a critical success factor for you to invest the time up front. The next one I want to talk about, and I realize that we jumped a few numbers here, so I want to talk about a few in detail, so the numbers are not out of sequence. This is the list, and then we'll come back and hit the list again with the ones that we haven't discussed in detail. So number 3 on the list is the lack of advanced planning for app deployment. What we're seeing is folks at the very last minute not having a good release plan in place and being surprised that how long it takes to make sure that your app is approved for deployment. Let me talk about that specifically from a consumer-facing perspective first, and then we'll talk about the considerations for enterprise apps. As far as consumer-facing applications are concerned, obviously this is going to be in an app store somewhere. I can't tell you how many times I've run into 1 month to go, and the organization is not even credentialed to be able to actually deploy something into one of these app stores. And now, in a lot of cases, they're not even certified and approved as a developer organization. There's also some regulatory audits. I'm sure you guys have seen lots of discussion in the press lately about not going through the appropriate amount of disclosure around privacy policies, aspects along those lines that require internal audits before you can put something in a consumer-facing app store. So be very mindful of those. We think that needs to be done very early as part of your deployment planning. On the enterprise app side, likewise, we're finding that as you create your enterprise app store, a lot of what the behaviors and what capabilities you may or may not have in the app store are unclear to people who are developing applications in an enterprise. They buy these capabilities as they buy the app store platform, but they haven't been deployed in a way that matches the function. So be very mindful in understanding what those are, making sure that there's appropriate resources who understand that app store management aspect of it, and make sure that they're involved in your app development so they know that the app is coming and that it'll need to be managed and it'll need to be profiled and it'll need to be hosted in that app store. In terms of being able to deploy that, which users does it go to, and are there a subset of users who get these applications in your MDM platform? Provisioning and profiling those and adding those to the profiles is very important as well. Again, a very key aspect of your deployment. I've also come across some areas where folks have gone through and they've been in the process of purchasing an app store platform or an MDM platform, and the purchase is not complete, and the users have gone through the testing and they're excited about the app, and the dependency on the MDM prevents them from being able to deploy the app. So something to be considered very early on. And updates in the release period, which is as you're going through and you release the internal application in some sort of a beta testing environment, how will you manage the updates during that process, and how will the users know when to jump in there and test the app in more of a containerized environment. Jumping to the number 5, which has to do with, as you develop applications, how do you account for the diversity of the devices out there, the diversity of the operating systems? And so this obviously is very relevant to the types of applications you're developing, especially relevant if you're thinking about including Android devices in your deployment. For consumer-facing applications, where in the past folks were looking at potentially an iOS deployment first, followed with an Android deployment, it's no longer the case. We feel that companies, or we see that the companies that don't have a consumer-facing application are launching with both in play. And so from an Android perspective, in a consumer world, you have to account for so many different OS variations, lots of different device variations, lots of different resolutions. And so how do you get around that? You have to make sure that you set a subset of devices that you must test all the way through, and then other devices that, and again, for this you need to leverage some research from industry resources that can help you understand what type of consumer app market share exists as it pertains to different devices, different operating systems, and different resolutions. And we find that as a question that comes up a lot as I talk to companies that are getting ready for planning and designing an app. From an enterprise app perspective, if you do have a BYOD scenario where there's going to be a lot of devices that are being brought in by the various employees, then it almost is, on the consumer end of the spectrum where your thinking needs to change to you don't have control over what device this is. You will get to see it as that device enrolls in your MDM platform, but by that time, it may be too late for you to be able to say, these are devices that I didn't account for in my application design. So again, leverage a little bit of the research from the industry so you understand what should you be defining and designing for. And along those lines, I'll offer this advice that, what we're seeing predominantly on the Android side is pick the top 5 to 10 devices, because that's a variable on the Android side that you have to account for. Variability by way of, different resolutions, and we suggest some here that we think are appropriate. And from an OS perspective, we have a recommended Gingerbread and onwards that we think covers a pretty big chunk of the share of Android operating system deployments. From an Apple perspective, things were great till the iPhone 5. Everything was a scaled version of one or the other resolution. That has changed with the iPhone 5, which has the 1136 by 640 resolution that we talk about here. But that too, it scales pretty nicely. So account for that. That's a new thing. A lot of applications that I still see in the App Store or with employee-facing apps as I walk into different organizations have not taken those into account and have not updated their applications to account for that resolution. So be very mindful of that. And also be careful in terms of you're not going to go get every single device out there to test, but make sure that the type of numbers where you're testing hit at least 90% of the resolutions and the operating systems out there. So from along the same lines, from a cross-platform development tool perspective, worth some discussion here as you look at deploying across multiple devices. Cross-platform development tool is definitely starting to factor into your decision in terms of your design and deployment. But keep in mind, it's not an answer to all of your problems for cross-platform app development. They're good at certain things, and there's still some gotchas associated with them. And if you do add those to the application development plan, then there's some specific considerations that you should keep in mind. They work well, especially even in enterprise environments when there's a BYOD environment you're considering, or of course for consumer apps. We're seeing a lot of new consumer apps coming out that are based on mobile application development platforms. And which ones to choose is a consideration that is important. Not all of them are equal. Some are better at certain things and others are better at others. In terms of from a tool-specific experience, it's very important to understand that the controls that you can and cannot deploy with if you use an MADP tool, they're getting better, but still it's not 100% overlap with what you can do natively versus what you can do in one of these MADP tools out there. From a licensing perspective, what does that mean during the development process as well as after the development process? That is a consideration I've seen people not take into account and be surprised at the last moment that their licensing arrangement with the MADP tool doesn't allow them to deploy to the broad audience that they're looking to deploy to. And those last-minute negotiations don't give you much leverage in terms of being able to get a favorable deal. Likewise, there's some overhead that's introduced when you develop on these MADP tools. Sometimes 2 to 3 times additional size in terms of the app download, as I pointed out earlier. Be very mindful of that. Through good architecture, you can reduce that delta, as well as you can think about what part of the app do you want to bring down and bundle, and what part of the app do you want to actually connect and download as the user interacts with the application. And then, of course, around MEDP, there's considerations for mobile web versus app. And as I shared earlier, it's heavily favored, apps are heavily favored as compared to mobile web. A mobile web can be the lowest common denominator, but we think that, and we think it has a place in enterprise app development, but for the most part, we're seeing folks moving towards mobile apps. The next consideration I want to talk about is testing, and I talk about it that today it's being done the good old way. What I mean by that is testing over the years had evolved into a fairly mature discipline, and even though it was a mature discipline, there were still some concerns for any time development ran over. It would typically fit, to the size of the timeline that was left, and we think that is changing now with mobile apps in terms of attitude, but not in terms of the resources and energy invested and the money invested in this specific phase of mobile app development. And what I mean by that is that it still is a little bit of a tendency that it tends to take a backseat to development is going over, let's not push the launch date, and let's try and squeeze in all the testing we can in that time, and then hope and a prayer, we think we're good enough, we can come back and fix it. The thing that's different this time around, though, keeping in mind that the user of those apps are a lot less forgiving, they're also very vocal. So they will not stop at just deleting your app if it doesn't work. They will tell everybody and that will listen out there with their comments that this is the bad experience they had with it. So we think it's worth taking a new look at testing and understanding that what you don't do in that phase, you're going to have to come back and fix, except that the next time around, you may not get a chance to be able to gain the trust of the user back. And so we think it's very important. And so with that, there's some considerations I wanted to share. Simulators are a big part of testing today. We think they are a great way to leverage some capabilities that are not that expensive. But at the same time, it is important to realize that they have limitations in terms of the testing results that you get out of them. They're a great way to do some spot testing, to get some early results as you start to get your application put together. And we think you need to go beyond that, which is there's a lot of organizations that rent their services where they have devices that they can actually test on your behalf. There's also services in the cloud that allow you to be able to, on a subscription model, be able to test against various different devices without having to buy those devices. There's quite a few that are popping up, some better than others, and we've seen some great results with some of these services where you can go in there and not only specify what device you're looking to use, but which carrier are you looking to test with. And I'll talk about that carrier-specific requirement in a minute, but that's very important when you go out and look for this type of a testing in the cloud service. And then, of course, there's no substitute for testing in the wild, which is if all of your testing is going to be sitting in the office where you have a Wi-Fi or you have a cellular connection that works well all the time, till you actually go out and test your app in real-world scenarios, we don't think you've completed the type of testing you should complete before the launch of your application. And I would say this one applies equally to consumer-facing applications as well as enterprise-facing applications. Employees of large companies traveling around the world, out in the field, oftentimes in areas where the coverage is not that great and cellular connections become an issue, how the application behaves is very important for you to understand the testing process. And then some other considerations around monitoring after launch, which is two aspects. One around being able to monitor user satisfaction as well as the feedback on bugs that your users might be finding. If you can address those quickly, that can be a resource. If you take a long time to fix the bugs that the users are finding, that can be your downfall as well. So look at that as initially it's a resource. In that one chance that somebody gives you, if they report a bug, treat that very carefully and get that addressed. that is one of the best testing resources as a last resort. Also look at your performance metrics, where as we come from the online world to the mobile world, the online clickstream analysis and weblog analysis, where we knew everything and anything about our websites, hasn't quite been where we have been with mobile applications. It's been really more of a build the app, put it out there, and then over time trying to find some metrics on what is getting used, how are different features behaving from a performance perspective, how are different layers of your architecture behaving is very important to understand. And very importantly, if the application does crash, at what point did it crash and what was the action that was being conducted. Without having those metrics, you're flying blind. And we still see, I would say, predominantly no focus on that type of metrics that you can capture from your application once it's deployed. I would say in 90% of the cases when I ask the question, how will you know how your application is doing, organizations don't have an answer for it. And it's not for the lack of tools. Some of the tools in that area are starting to become very good. Even if you don't do anything, some basic understanding of the metrics of how the application behaves is very, very critical. And so what are the types of testing? I have some thoughts here in terms of how do you test poor navigation? You know, it is, unless you actually sit down some folks who are going to be using the application and go through it. And this should actually never be the thing that gets caught at testing time. Hopefully this is something that in visualization and application development has been addressed. But nonetheless, it could be something that it can still be addressed during testing. If the application crashes or freezes, are you testing for that or not? And when does it happen? That's the most obvious types of testing scenarios. But testing the time it takes to launch the applications, or when you have other applications running, the application may fail to launch, or unexpected behaviors on certain screens. So I want to dive into this a little bit more in terms of the types of some mobile-specific considerations that need to be added as a discipline to your testing competencies. You know, testing for different resolutions, I talked about that, testing for different orientation, testing for different devices, some that have soft keyboards, others that have hard keyboards. How does it behave when you actually switch from one to the other? Testing for battery drain. It's a new world when it comes to wasn't something that you would typically test for in the traditional world. And so what does it do? What does it mean in terms of, you know, when you're on 3G versus Wi-Fi or cellular versus Wi-Fi, how does the battery behave? And again, it's at the bottom of the list. In some cases, people are not even aware that these things need to be tested. Gestures, obviously, very mobile specific, something that is not very easy to test if you're not thinking about it. Carrier specific testing in terms of behaves great when it's on carrier A versus carrier B. You won't find that out unless you actually go out and find that the different flavors of devices on different carriers. And this is where those mobile testing services in the cloud come in handy, that you can actually configure a device sitting here tomorrow to say, I would like to deploy this in Japan, and here's a carrier that I would like to deploy it with, and here's the device that I'm looking at with this much memory in it. And you can configure it that way. So you can get very specific with some of these testing capabilities that are available now. How does the device, how do you test it for if you're in the app and you receive an incoming call, or there's an SMS that arrives, or your navigation is on and the you know, turn-by-turn navigation voice comes on. Those, again, I'm not seeing those in a lot of the basic testing scenarios that we're seeing with companies. We're advising them on. It needs to grow to be very mobile specific. You cannot take the old school way of thinking about testing and just apply it. A lot of it comes over, but there are some very specific mobile considerations that are involved as well. So I think from a testing perspective, I think, you know, we can come back and touch on some of the specific tools if there's any questions on it. One other area that is very important, I'll wrap up with this number 10, which is there's no defined approach for support and maintenance. And what I mean by that is we get to the point where we've done a great job building the app, we've tested it, let's say, and we're ready to launch it. And once you launch it, what happens afterwards is a mystery to a lot of companies as well. And in a lot of cases, they're surprised by how much effort goes into this. And so there's three specific areas I want to spend some time talking about when it comes to support and maintenance. The critical part once you launch is, where do people go when they need help? And that's the support and help desk part. The second one is around monitoring, which I think we talked about a little bit from a testing perspective, but I want to share a few other aspects of how do you monitor your application going forward. And then once application in the mobile world, you're iterating so often that, as new considerations in the market come out, how do you make sure that there's a plan for maintenance and ongoing app administration? So let's dive into this, and I'll share some of the things that we're seeing. And so I'm sure we're all familiar with, we built websites, and there was a great interactive self-service channel, and then we had to build huge departments to support those websites. And you could call into an organization and say, hey, I need to get technical support on using this website. Those days are over. It is very hard, and it's difficult to even conceive the thought that anybody and everybody that's a mobile app user who wants to interact with your organization could potentially get help on their mobile app. It is a business model that would get in the way of truly being able to leverage mobile. So what are some of the things that you should be thinking about in the absence of that is that for enterprise applications, there is a lot of confusion around, do I call the help desk that typically is available to me in IT that does desktop support? If I have an issue where I can't connect, do I call the carrier? Do I have an issue with my data plan, with my voice plan, or do I call Best Buy, which is where I bought my device from? And so that confusion has to be eliminated, and you have to map out for the user, for their benefit, where do they go, who do they turn to, and which use cases are supported by which channel. So, for example, from a help desk perspective, what types of calls will you take, and which type of calls are outside the scope of the type of mobile application support that the IT organization will provide. The other aspect to be very careful about is, even if you make that very clear, when you're launching your first few applications, depending on how large is the user community to which that is being launched, you will see a spike in the volume of calls that are coming in. And even if it is to just say, for that support, here's a resource that you need to go to, a lot of organizations are caught by surprise that their metrics get skewed when it comes to help desk metrics, just because people don't know any better, and they just know that their last line of defense is to call the help desk. And so what I mean by that is, you have to plan for when that call is received, where do you point them to? In a lot of cases, we're seeing this help desk light model, which is internal forums, internal helpful resources, FAQs, which do not exist today, especially if you're in the early parts of deploying enterprise applications. Starting to build that as an investment, but it has to be a burden that the first few applications will have to shoulder, and which is why a lot of times people are not paying enough attention to it. You have to plan that as a line item that is not part of your application budget. You have to plan that as an organizational infrastructure item so that all applications can benefit from it. And so whether you're building one application or you haven't built one, that's one of the areas that you should start thinking about right away. If you're thinking, and from a consumer application perspective, once the application is out there, who's monitoring the feedback around the application in social media, just in the app stores, and how are people talking about it? How are you managing the reputation out there? Is the marketing department ready for it? Oftentimes we find that they are not. And it is something that starts off with somebody trying to help out. The volume gets overwhelming, and quite frankly, they give up. It is not one of those things that you want to give up on. That is something that you cannot take back. It is something that has to be very proactively managed. And so plan for that from the get-go. We think it's one of the most important considerations from our top 10 list. Likewise, from the monitoring side, I talked about it a little bit in the testing area, where ongoing testing is an important part. As you monitor your application with performance monitoring tools, you should be testing for the fixes you're putting in and make sure that they're done at the same level of rigor that you used when you first deployed the application. Feedback management we talked about. A specific case I wanted to point out around developer licenses, you have to monitor those to make sure that your apps are your contracts don't expire. I have personally been testing applications for clients who have had those consumer applications out there for a while, and in some cases there's contracts associated with them that expire. The app is still there, but some of the follow-up details you cannot actually interact with. So it can create an embarrassing situation. In some cases, I've also seen that nobody knows who owns that contract. So if it does expire, even if you go into scramble mode, you may have a tough time lining up the right people to be able to take care of it. The last area, the maintenance and ongoing support, very important to budget for this. In a lot of cases, your first iteration is not the one and done that you're after, but in some cases that does happen, where you build an application and you feel like you've achieved a milestone and this application does what it's expected to do, especially for enterprise use cases where it's a quick fix to a business use case. But then from there, the application can suffer a lot if there's no plan to fix bugs, if there's no plan to update the app as new operating system updates come out, if there's security issues that are identified, is there a budget to go do that? We find that the budget is more of an afterthought and it's very limited. In a lot of cases, there's not even any thought put into what happens after we go live, who owns it, who manages it, who maintains it. So those are the ones that out of the top 10 I wanted to go through. As I pointed out earlier, we covered 5 of those in detail. But in doing that, I was trying to make sure that some of the other ones get addressed as well. And so I wanted to leave this in the top 10 list on here. You will obviously be receiving a copy of this as well as part of the presentation. And in the time that we have left, as we spend some time here answering questions, hopefully if your specific area or if there's something that's top of mind has not been addressed in the discussion, we'll try and address that in the questions that we take from here on. So as you go through this, what are some of the things that you can do to make sure that you don't get caught in one of these gotchas and you don't get, it's not something that you have to face going forward? One of the things that we recommend and that's worked very well as an approach is to, as you start to think about your application, as you start to scope and plan your application, spend the time up front to make sure that you have risk mitigation strategies in not only those 10 areas, but some of the other enterprise-specific, your company-specific areas as well. And we recommend this approach, as you will see, as a 4-step process, where from step 1 to step 3, what you're doing is to understand what application you're building in step 1, but then very quickly, once you know that, visualize that application through a prototype. Figure out the technical approach, which is no different than what a lot of folks do in traditional application development. Perhaps the prototype is something that needs to be done at a level where it exposes a lot of the aspects that you don't want to expose when you get to testing and those types of areas. But then the app roadmap is very important to do, which is what features are you going to build, when are you going to build them, and for those features, what kind of a test plan, what kind of deployment plan we'll need to have. Step 3 is the part that in most cases I find companies don't even think about. They'll do a prototype, in some cases not even a prototype, they'll go from a requirements document and just start coding. And that's the typical SDLC process a lot of organizations are used to. So step 3 is where we think that's money well spent, effort well spent, where you're starting to think through what approach are we going to take, what are the considerations that could potentially come back and hurt us. We've shared those with you today. Hopefully as you go forward, you will include those in your support planning, in your release planning, in your launch planning. As you go and build and deploy the application, you're able to plan for some ongoing support. The end stage is not the deployed application. The end stage is the ongoing support of that application. Very important aspect that gets lost in translation somehow every time. So here's an approach that's worked very well for us. We packaged this into a Kickstart, and I wanted to share this with you as well. That's something that we have been very successful with. One last thing, as you hear these conversations, it's almost a counterpoint, which is the goal of this is not to scare you to where you get caught in analysis paralysis and do nothing. The cost of doing nothing, I would say, is the 11th gotcha, which is you get so tentative about approaching this mobile app development that you leave a lot of business value and ROI on the table, and you wait too long to do this. And which is why, as I shared that approach, I'm sure you would have noticed that it's very quick. It's 2 weeks is the recommended process. And if you do it right, you can, in that 2-week process, accomplish all of what's needed. So I want to share this with you as well, that not only has that been successful, we've also been very successful in doing that in very, very rapid time frames. And so that's what I had prepared to share with you today by way of the top 10 gotchas, as well as some discussion around it. I'm going to turn it over to Adam for to take some follow-on questions, and we'll try and address as many as we can in the next few minutes.
Great. Thanks a lot, Shahab. And again, I wanted to thank everyone for the great participation and some of the excellent questions that have been asked so far, and remind you that we still have time for a few additional questions. So if you use the Q&A function on the WebEx screen to ask some questions for Shahab, or we're also following Twitter with the hashtag mobile strategy. So before we get to the questions, I just wanted to present to you a special offer. Shahab talked to you about our mobile app scoping and planning kickstart. I encourage you to go to our website, propelix.com, and look at information on our kickstart. There's a PDF that you can download. There's no form to fill out in order to download it, so you can go grab it there. We are offering a 1-hour free mobile advisory call with Shahab or someone on our team. You can email us at info@propelix.com and use the code TOP10, and we'd be happy to set up an advisory call. There are a few questions, so thank you very much. Shahab, I'm going to start off with one that we got asked a number of times leading up to the webinar, and Dawn asked it on the webinar today. Are cross-platform solutions enterprise ready?
Yeah, great question. I think they're definitely ready for certain type of applications. I wouldn't quite look at them yet as they're a replacement for all other skills within the organization for all mobile application development. As long as you treat them with that caveat, they definitely have a place in your mobile application development. I would say 60 to 70% of your portfolio will lend itself very well to leveraging a cross-platform development tool. And as that happens, we have seen some great advances in the top 3 or 4 that we consider are enterprise ready for prime time in the last 6 to 8 months. And so they've gone from a list of things that they could do well to truly an enterprise-grade platform that will pass muster with any kind of internal SDLC process. So the short answer would be yes, they are, with some caveats. There are certain things they're not good at. As long as you stay away from those, definitely should be a part of your consideration.
Great. The next question, let me go to Joe here. The next question is, with the advancement of HTML5, do you see web and hybrid apps gaining adoption rates as compared to native apps?
Great question. They are. Definitely HTML5 has changed so from the spectrum of mobile web to web-based apps to the native apps. I think HTML5 is going to introduce that middle piece missing between very flat HTML applications to the native applications. I think there's some great capabilities in terms of the disconnected use. I think it should definitely be, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. We think your portfolio of applications, when you're done with it, will be made up of all of those technologies, which is actually, going back to the previous question, it ties into the cross-platform development tool as well. You want to make sure that you're able to develop all those types of applications in your cross-platform development tool. When it comes to HTML5, it is by its very nature, very light footprint on the device. There's still some device-specific considerations from HTML5. So absolutely, we think it's definitely something to keep on the radar. Just know when to use which type of architecture.
Great, thanks. And we have a question from Murali, and Shahab just prefaced this with PropelX is vendor agnostic, but we have seen a lot of cross-platform development tools, and when it comes to them, the question from Murali is, what are some good consumer-specific cross-platform tools?
So again, as Adam said, we are vendor agnostic. One that we have seen just in terms of the deployed base and enough there that we think we can now point to is Titanium by Accelerator. We've actually had a lot of experience with that. We think that's actually doing very well in the enterprise space. IBM is making some great strides in that space as well with the WorkLife product. We think that one also has some capabilities that are worth considering. On more on the web side of things, PhoneGap and Sencha Touch, a combination of the two, we're seeing them getting adopted pretty heavily. Those would be the ones that are the top of mind. I would Antennas platform too, I think is worth considering. But those are some of the ones that I would point to, and again, match those up to what your needs are, what your portfolio looks like, what your internal skill sets look like, and what you're looking to do. But those would be some of the ones that jump to the top of the list.
Yeah, and I'd mentioned that one of the services that we're offering that's becoming increasingly more popular with our clients is a cross-platform tool vendor evaluation. And it's something that we're running more and more for our clients who are looking at examining these tools, and sometimes they're prototyping multiple tools and then making the decision on what to go forward with. Let me move here to Elsie, and she asks, are testing capabilities included within MDM solutions that tackle some of the testing considerations that you covered? And I'd also tie that, Shahab, to MADP, or cross-platform development tool. There's testing embedded there.
Yeah, so when it comes to MDM tools, they are not. There are some that claim that they have it, but I would say testing the way we talked about it today, you really want to go to more of a mobile app-specific testing platform. When it comes to MADP tools, though, there are some great capabilities that are included. Again, know the boundaries of what they are. They are great tools to be able to test the stuff more at a developer level. They're also great to be able to do some end-to-end testing, but they don't have the capabilities that I talked about from a device, carrier-specific, out in the field type of testing. And for that, there's the add-ons that you would need to go to, and those are the ones that really get you in the end. So the short answer, MADP, yes, they're included, but it doesn't suffice just to stick to that. You need to augment those with additional testing tools.
Yeah, and I'd say that the market is consolidating, and some of the cross-platform tools are now OEMing testing tools and including them in their platform. So the market is consolidating a little bit, and it changes all the time. Brianna is asking a great question about, she says that she's experienced pretty much all of the 10 gotchas, and her concern is that what if you mentioned one about the consumer losing faith in receiving good applications because of all the crashes and bugs after deployment. How do you, if you are at that point, how do you turn that around?
That's a great question. I think it's about making a statement. If, like I said, folks are very unforgiving, they will very likely not come back easily. So it'll have to be something that is somewhat of a drastic statement that you need to make by way of improving and addressing so that now your applications don't suffer from these gotchas. The quality of the application, how you're deploying them, how you're thinking about them, how you're designing them has to go through a radical, transformation. And we've seen this where, especially for retailers, banks, we saw this a lot. They were the first ones to jump out there with consumer-facing applications. And honestly, as they gave up on it, you saw that the feedback sort of started to trail as well. And then we've seen some renewed efforts where they have come back and apologize for these were our first forays into mobile. As long as it's backed up with something great, I think people will come back. It is an uphill battle, but it's not one that you cannot engage in. But I think it has to be something where you have to have, especially if you've dealt with these firsthand already, going back and trying to fix them incrementally is not going to get you there. You're going to have to take a step back and say, how do we make sure that this time around we are not asking for a third chance?
Great. Thanks, Shahab. Let's see. Let me go to let me go to a question about one of the considerations you had up there around app analytics. And without going into the whole thing, can you just touch on what you meant by app analytics as a pitfall?
Yeah. So as I talked a little bit about it, consider them to be something that provides you some metrics that is from real-time use. And so, data on performance on the various different metrics from data interchange within the stacks of the application, coming back from the database, time in transit, between the different components, the controllers, the display, all of the different aspects of your application. Those are events that can be understood and trapped. Those are events that can be, that's information that's very useful oftentimes in a lot of debugging. It's just like having a debugger that you have forgotten to turn on. So when it comes time to do some optimization, you really don't have any data. And it's a great opportunity because once you, especially for applications that have been out there for a while, there can be a wealth of data. The second aspect of that is you can turn it on but not know what to do with that data. So having some good analytics on the data that the app is producing, you need to make sure that you have some analytics built into it. And so tools like Keen.io or Applause are things to consider that give you good visibility into what your application is doing.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Martin asked a question about the pitfalls around user authentication in a corporate or business application development scenario. Maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of some of the security aspects of a corporate, a B2E or a B2E2C type deployment.
Yeah, so I think from a credentials perspective, I can't tell you how many times we've faced a situation where clients are struggling with, it worked great when we used it in the office. We did some limited testing in our distributed offices and worked great from an authentication perspective. Coming back through the ports, authenticating with something along the lines of Active Directory is a very typical scenario these days. Oftentimes, it doesn't work that well, especially if you have if the app is not architected in a way where it can suffer cellular outage, let's say, or you're out of range. When you come back into range, what happens? So things along those lines have to be taken into account. As far as user authentication itself, there's some best practices around B2E and B2B applications that are actually, that area is pretty standard in terms of what you should and should not be doing in terms of two-factor authentication, in terms of just the minimum requirements that your risk and audit group will allow you to roll out with. Implementation of that, we think, still struggles just because mobile application architects, I don't think, are all the way there in terms of being able to get their arms around it. So I would say those best practices are something that we can certainly, and if you want in a follow-up conversation, we can certainly walk you through. The implementation of that is something that has to be monitored to make sure they're being implemented against those best practices.
Great. It's now, we're running on 2 o'clock. There are a ton more questions coming in. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we can get to them offline. We can post some of the answers on our website. We recommend, we hope that you take advantage of our free 1-hour advisory call, and I want to thank you very much for attending our webinar today. And this will conclude the event. Thank you, Shahab, for presenting. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.